in the latest United Nations City Report, of the over 1,400 cities that had inhabitants of over 500,000, 60% were at high risk of exposure to at least one of 6 types of natural disaster, namely cyclones, floods, droughts, earthquakes, landslides, or volcanic eruptions. Now, I'm not suggesting that London or Toronto are necessarily exposed to any of those right at this moment, but it does bring me on nicely to the second panel, managing risks, which will be moderated by Kate Braw, partner at Dentons. Kate leads the firm's global client engagement and development program. Her responsibilities include leadership and oversight of the firm's client listening initiatives around the world. And picking up on some of the marks made by Simon and Gayatri on the need for innovation in planning and regulation and the need for clear rules, Hatch, Dentons, and Aon will consider and outline the major risks associated with some of these projects and how they can be mitigated. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Simon, and great to be with all of you here today. I think we have all our panelists for this discussion on with us. We have Meredith Jones from Aon. Hi, Meredith, good to see you. We have Susan McGeechee from Hatch, and we have Stephen Shergold from Dentons, and he's my partner in London. Just trying to find, hi there, Susan, good to see you as well. So with that brief introduction from Simon, I think I'm actually going to start with you, Meredith, if that's all right. And Simon's description of some of the events that we've seen over the past several years. And as you're sitting in the insurance space, what are the risks that you're seeing to cities, and how can we mitigate those? And what are you seeing in terms of the impact on insurance availability?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me for today's panel. Hopefully I remember to unmute myself, which is often one of the biggest challenges that I face in any one of these scenarios. I think it's really an interesting question about the role that insurance can play in making communities and cities sustainable. And, when we start to think about this, we have to think about it from the perspective of, I think we're all pretty ingrained, including in the insurance industry, to think about peak peril events, the big storms, the weather events that Simon just mentioned. But what we're actually seeing with climate change is that we're having an increased frequency of moderate severity events, which can have the same or even a bigger impact on the livability of a city or the whether a community thrives or not. And so if you look, for example, at just the real estate markets, when I was talking to a colleague in Toronto not too long ago, she was telling me that it was 30 degrees inside of her apartment in Toronto. And that led to a discussion that in Toronto, there are 1,200 high-rise buildings that were built before 1950, and 94% of the folks in those buildings don't have access to air conditioning, which of course is going to be a problem going forward. So for rental units, obviously that can cause an issue for the folks that own the building. For people that are looking to buy units in those types of buildings, there is a good chance that those types of situations will become much less desirable, which will of course push pricing down for those particular units. For businesses that are in the area, if people don't choose to live in that particular area anymore, they may choose to move somewhere else where they have better access to talent. So all of that can have an impact directly on a city or a community, but it can also have much bigger repercussions throughout the capital stack. Through the way that it interacts with banks, for example. When banks make loans to individuals or to companies to buy real estate, those loans are made with the actual property as the collateral. And the assumption is of course, that the property values over time are going to go up. And so if you take the example of increasing heat or areas where there is increasing moderate but very frequent peril, if people don't want to live there because there is a higher cost of repairs to their building because the employers aren't there, or simply because it's not a desirable place to live, then of course that assumption breaks down and the property values start to decline, which leaves a large mismatch on the balance sheet of the banks, who now have these outstanding loans that are no longer well collateralized, and also the risk of default on those loans goes up. And so that creates a more indirect but much more systemic risk within the local and global economies for being able to get capital to invest in real estate. It creates risk within the property values, and so I think when we look at it, we're looking at it as we've got a lot more uncertainty than maybe we would have thought about 10 years ago, as it relates to peak peril versus frequent moderate peril, and also the interconnectedness of all of these different factors and how that can impact the livability of a city.
And I'm going to just turn to Stephen for a moment on that, because of course we're all working then within a regulated space. How do you see these factors playing into that regulatory environment within the cities? And then I think I'll come back to you, Meredith, with a couple more follow-up.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, and it's interesting to pick up on Meredith's point there around the perils and the increased instance of those moderate perils, because when we think a lot about legal liability, whether it's because you're operating a regulated activity, which means that you may well be managing products or chemicals that could potentially damage the environment, we think about whether damage that is caused from the activity is foreseeable. Because if it's unforeseeable, then quite often you might have a defense against a breach, or even in a neighborhood scenario, where material or pollutants escape your land and damage your neighbor. There's always the question of foreseeability in that issue as to whether or not you're liable for the losses next door. And what we really see, I think, with this increased occurrence of adverse weather is that we're moving from the unforeseeable to the foreseeable. So, over the last couple of years, we've dealt with situations where an increasingly hot period was an underlying cause of a fire. The fire led to the collapse of a warehouse and the loss of the chemical product through the fire waters on the site and the liabilities that arose from that. You also deal with flooding and flooding breaching containment on a site and losing product. But perhaps one of the more closer to home examples in London on the Thames is increased erosion of the bank through the intensity and regularity of intense rainfall. Now, if you're storing or if you have substances buried beneath the surface that become exposed through the bank erosion, then you're going to get into that position of legal liability. And whereas over the last few years, we've been able to argue, well, that's unforeseeable. Now, as I say, it's becoming much more foreseeable. So it's really important, I think, for businesses to map and manage those risks.
Well, I'm actually going to turn to Susan, and I will come back to you, Meredith. But Stephen sparked some thoughts. Susan, one of the things that we had talked about, and Stephen's touched upon it a little bit, and of course this whole conversation is triggered by how we wound up in this place at the moment, and what is the role of cities and what is happening in cities in terms of what cities do and who they are in terms of being greenhouse gas emitters and source of greenhouse gases. And as we're talking about these dynamics that Meredith and Stephen talked about, and Stephen mentioned, what do businesses need to be thinking about as you function and operate and think about engaging with municipalities and cities as we try to tackle emissions reductions. How should mindsets change to achieve reduction objectives and exposure issues?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. It's funny because you mentioned companies, and cities are more challenging to engage with than companies, just because there are so many moving parts to them, and so they develop, and sometimes they don't develop as strategically as perhaps they could, and I think with climate change that's been an issue. So, there is more transparency, I guess, or more drivers for transparency around city performance than there ever has been. There has been, through the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, the cities report that's been around for a while, but still relatively new compared to what companies have been doing. And also now the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which asks issuers to disclose their exposure to climate change from GHG exposure, so their exposure to the low carbon transition, the financial impact of that, as well as Meredith and Stephen were talking about the physical risk as well. So how will changing weather impact them? So cities are now included in that. That some are voluntarily committing to report against the TCFD. So that enables them, it enables decision makers. I mean, we just had the financing panel before this. It enables decision makers to have more visibility into how cities are managing the risks associated with the physical impacts, as well as the low carbon transition, and what they're going to be doing over the next 10 years, 20 years, 30, out to 50 years. What are they going to be doing to mitigate those risks? And I think some of the challenges will be that you're going to be identifying the opportunities, and there are, the TCFD is an opportunity to do that exercise as well. Infrastructure Canada has a climate lens assessment requirement, and so any federally funded infrastructure project, including municipal projects, will have to undergo a climate lens assessment. And what's so great about that is it actually does enable a lens of looking through the GHG mitigation potential and what are some opportunities to improve the GHG mitigation potential through the design. And also it looks at the resilience of the project against changing weather. So that would apply, to any municipality across Canada, so that you can, make some decisions about how you might change the design. And again, it gives it more transparency. And then, ideally, there's you're identifying all of the opportunities, and you can potentially, factor them into the design. The only, I guess one of the challenges, probably not the only challenge, but one of the challenges I'll really focus on right now is there's still this procurement in terms of lowest cost procurement. So when you start to incorporate some of the opportunities that are identified through any of these other frameworks, you are actually also increasing the cost of some of the solutions. So how is that played out? And is it going to be a regulatory driver? Is it going to be a financing driver in terms of, if we're going to issue a green bond, is it going to be acceptable if it hasn't, kind of put through some of these opportunities? So I think the transparency, and then figuring out, we've identified now the opportunities, and we still can't necessarily capitalize on some of the opportunities, is going to be a feature. And then the last thing I'll really quickly say is, Toronto is still a pretty new city. So there is the retrofits, as Meredith was saying, there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of the retrofitting, and we have to rethink some of the decisions we made previously, like the development of a lot of condominiums without any public transit. That's being addressed now. The condos went in first, as opposed to, kind of a holistic strategy. And also, Meredith, you talked about some of the condos and their resilience to some, even just extreme temperatures. There are also, a lot of glass condos. So the retrofit piece is a part of it. And then the other second piece is new development. We're going to have lots of opportunities still for new development. And how do we think about that holistically? I know Metrolinx is thinking about putting in electric rail and planning for electric rail in new plans, which makes sense because Ontario has a clean grid. But then what do we do also with the legacy diesel trains? Is it renewable diesel? Is it electrification? So thinking through new development and retrofits.
So I'm actually going to go back to Stephen because of the new city versus old city conversation. Then I'm going to come back to Meredith, and she's actually going to end up having our last word. But Stephen, any thoughts or commentary about what Susan just said about new cities and older cities? Because of course, London has a much different infrastructure than Toronto might.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the point that I'd really like to pick up on is the drawing together some of the points that Susan made in our previous panel in relation to building back greener and how you facilitate that and the regulatory mechanisms that you need to bring certainty and deliverability to that in the construction sector. I think the mechanisms are already in play, and to kind of answer the question around, well, what should we be doing now? What's the risk? I would urge people to anticipate that within a very near-term horizon, you will need to be accounting for the inherent carbon in your construction products. If you look at the sustainable batteries regulation, for example, in the EU, the consideration of a carbon certificate that comes with the battery to illustrate the inherent carbon in the supply chain, I think is a mechanism that could easily be developed for construction materials as well, so that we understand that inherent carbon. Now, I think a big challenge here is around bridging the gap to net zero, because there will be inherent carbon in that supply chain, and the integrating the offset markets with the voluntary carbon schemes, the methodologies in there, and having a robust and verified approach to using offsets to demonstrate carbon neutrality in the supply chain, I think is something that will need to a degree, come within the sphere of regulation as well. But the starting point, I think, for everybody right now is to start to measure, request and analyze the carbon inherent in your supply chain so that you can start to manage it. These regulations are coming.
Great, and if thanks for that, Stephen. If I come back to you, Meredith, who you now have been waiting patiently from the beginning with lots of promises that I would come back to you, but just your observations again, from the insurance perspective, what are the pieces that will need to come together to start to create perhaps greater predictability and certainty in managing those the risks that we've been talking about?
Well, I think that Stephen and Susan make great points that, we have to get better about measuring and being transparent about the different contributors to greenhouse gas emissions and the inherent carbon, as Stephen said, in the processes we use. I do think that generally speaking, in many ways, some of those things are improving. I mean, obviously, within the real estate framework, we have GRESB, which is doing an excellent job of helping fund managers in particular think about how sustainable the projects that they're involved with, both on the real estate and the infrastructure side. Obviously, TCFD, CDP, all of the various regimes out there that are encouraging corporate issuers, cities, investors, pretty much everyone in the global economy to really have a unified way of thinking through this. I think that the key for me is that making sure that the entire capital stack is involved in the solution. So it's not just about green bonds. It's not just about what cities can do to spend on adaptation or mitigation. I think the way that we've been looking at it is how can everything, again, based on that interconnectedness, that you can't have weather implications within a particular building and not have those have implications on the people that live there, the city, the employers, the banks, pretty much, that kind of starburst effect, that as a result, everybody has a role to play in trying to make cities more sustainable. And so when we look at that from an insurance standpoint, we're looking at things like, how can we provide insurance around green bonds or sustainability KPI linked bonds to encourage adaptation, construction, and also to encourage better behavior from the people that are getting the sustainability KPI linked bonds. We're also talking about things like how can we help to mitigate some of the risks to cities from inclement weather and climate change events in terms of the city's budget. So one of the things that we've been working on is, can we create a parametric cover for municipalities that in the event of a single trigger event, whether it is a peak peril event or one of these more moderate level events, that would kick in and help to pay expenses for that municipality, whether it is for essential workers, whether it is for building back greener or better, whatever it might be. I think there's a lot of tools in the toolbox. It's just getting everybody engaged and trying to come up with a solution that is going to work for everybody in that particular stakeholder model, which in the case of cities is kind of everybody.
Fantastic. Thank you, Meredith. And I see Simon has joined us again. So, but lots to think about. Clearly, the need for a holistic approach for all of these pieces to come together, and for a great deal of cooperation. But thank you all, and I'll turn it back to Simon.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Susan, Stephen, and Meredith for your remarks. I mean, I think it's clear that there are several risks that need to be mitigated, and I'm guessing with city budget stretched following the pandemic, failure to do this potentially has knock-on across all the socioeconomic groups, and perhaps some of the smaller ones, lower ones, getting impacted the hardest, which we clearly need to manage against.